tonight's event. It means a lot to me and my siblings for this reason as well. And I hope that you've enjoyed it so far and that all of that energy continues on throughout the rest of the evening. And with that, I give you breaking up with who I thought I was. So let's start off. Part one. Not so much the very beginning, but it's pretty darn close. It's one of my biggest fears. I'm not going to remember everything that I want to say. But let's start off with a question. You can be anything you want in life, but what happens when you never seem to be good enough? So thinking back to where this adventure all started was difficult because I couldn't really decipher when it started. So then I started thinking, was it when I was a kid? No, that's way too far. So then was it a couple days ago? But no, that's way too recent. So then I figured, let's start right about here. That's me in high school, just a typical teenager on the outside, but on the inside, my head was deeply buried in trying to figure out who the heck I was and where in the world I was going. But before we get to that, let's start with basics. I was born in a family of 5 with my parents, my older brother Kevin, and my younger sister Celine. And let me tell you, all the stereotypes that you hear about middle children, they're all absolutely true. I was compared left and right to my siblings. Kevin is the firstborn. Naturally, everything and everyone else that followed could never measure up to him. My sister's the youngest, so she's a baby and an angel. Anyone who's ever met her can attest to this. And you would think that, so to take this a step further, like my parents would say, like, you should be more like your sister, or you should do what your brother does. And you would think that this would end at some point, but the comparisons and the expectations only grew more extravagant and more difficult to surpass. So you would say, look at your brother, married, kid in the house at 23, should be more like him. Or your sister decided to go into nursing, why couldn't you do that? She's even a national cheer champion. Or what are you even going to do with English? We told you to be more practical with your life. Or worse, my family members would threaten my sister and say, you don't want to end up like Cate, do you? For the longest time, all of these phrases seemed valid and logical to me. Like I was looked on as average or a medium between my brother and my sister, but never special enough to be distinguished among them. Never can I measure up to the expectations that were held against me. And you see, the problem with this is that something that I still struggle with today is that what was wrong with me in the first place? Like, what was it about me that bothered them so much? Why was I used as a threat? Don't be like your sister. And something that still, I still struggle with this today because you live your whole life with yourself and you start to wonder, where do you fit in? I was never really good enough. Which brings us to part 2. A period of my life that is too convoluted to think of as the name title. Mid-high school is when I started to realize that it was the little things that bothered my family so much about who I was. I working all my time. I spent too much time with my friends and not enough with academia. I would constantly question the things that they would tell me instead of being obedient like they expected me to. I never listened to them. I did things that they disapproved of, but I was told that I should watch what I do and say because they didn't want to go out in public and feel as if they had the most embarrassing daughter. Or I was told that I was conceited and selfish because I did things that I wanted and did behave accordingly like my siblings did. Really emotional. I talked back, I was disrespectful, and because of all of this, I developed through peer orientation, which is when kids are more influenced by their peers rather than adults or their parents or other authoritative figures. And at this point, I figured my family could care less about me, but my friends cared, so that was okay. I became a reflection of who they were. So every year, I seemed to be a different version of who I thought I should be. So there was sporty Cate, or relationship Cate, or rebellious and party girl Cate. There was even girly Cate or teacher pet Cate. It was basically the Spice Girls, but just one. It was like my body was a circle, and all these personas were squares and triangles, and no matter which way I tried, none of them would seem to fit perfectly. None of them would measure up to who I thought I should be. None of them were good enough. Which brings us to part 3, the totally cliche downward spiral with more rock bottoms than I thought possible. So, dating was an integral part of my high school life, and it was mostly because through these relationships, I always found a reason to be good enough. I hated the thought of being alone, and it was the relationship proved to be the way in which I could successfully find outward gratification and approval and verification of who I was. quick shot to the other side, which is sadness. And the thing is with these heartbreaks that they weren't just any normal high school heartbreaks. That I really invested in myself in these relationships because, and when they ended, I started to believe that if they didn't think I was good enough, just as my family did, then who then thought I was? And all that investing in myself in the relationships, and when they ended, I was left to pick up the pieces and start rebuilding on what they need. And it wasn't until later that I realized that what I was feeling wasn't just sadness or teen angst. There was confusion and lack of direction, and in a word, it was depression. So that's rock bottom number one. This all began to culminate with the death of my grandmother, and a few years before she passed away, I didn't spend a lot of time with her. I ignored her. I often pushed her aside, and I spent much more time doing typical teenager things. And when she did pass away, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I spent my days overthinking all of my decisions, having never spent time with her, regretting this fact, and thinking that I was the worst granddaughter and that everything that my family has ever said about me was true. I began internalizing it all, and I started to believe my biggest fear. I wasn't and never will be good enough. And that's rock bottom number two. But thankfully, that brings us to rock bottom number three, the end of the beginning. So I was engaged at one point in my life, believe it or not, and for the longest time, I formed myself around who I thought I should be, and I thought for the first time that I was being praised for being exactly myself and who I should be. And when that ended, that was the last straw. I was stripped of every single part of me, and it was because within this relationship, I had done the exact same thing with my others, that I sought outward gratification and approval. And it was then that I realized that something had to change. And at 19 years old, I was severely underweight. I was struggling in school, lacking proper sleep, and hospitalized twice for malnourishment. And in the 15 minutes prior to my 20th birthday, I sat in my car and I broke down thinking how I could have lived the last 2 decades having accomplished absolutely nothing. I have nothing to show for the last 20 years. Never had I ever questioned and felt insecure and hated, absolutely devalued that I had in these 3 rock bottoms with a suicide attempt at the end of each. Never being good enough was an absolute reality. But thankfully, that brings us to part 4. Why breaking up with myself was the most difficult heartbreak I've ever experienced, even though it was the best thing for me. Okay, how's everyone else doing out there? Because my heart is absolutely racing. I've never talked about my insecurities in such a class before. But it was all a little too pessimistic. That's okay, because that's the end of that. Here's the real reason why I'm even in front of you here today talking about it. The life I currently live is all about a good vibe, sending positivity out into the universe, seemingly never having a bad day because all I really ever do is laugh and smile and living the most zen and holistic lifestyle possible. But it wasn't always sunshine and rainbows, because there came a time in my life, around January of last year, that I realized that something needed to change. I started cleansing all the things out of my life that didn't sit well with my soul. Self-criticism, self-deprecation, self-perpetuated suffering, self-doubt, and even a lack of self-esteem. But what I started to realize is that when I was reading all of these negatives out of my life, I started to wonder what was left. You live with your whole life with yourself, and when you realize that you need an overhaul of your life, you start to wonder who the heck you were in the first place. You build this rapport with who you've been for the last decade or so, and to watch it all slowly crumble is nearly as painful as when a significant other falls out of love. I was falling out of love with who I was because I didn't want to continue living a life of feeling devalued. And to be honest, I never quite figured out who I was back then, but I know who I don't want to be now. And that's average or not good enough, or feeling as if I'm the most unaccomplished 21-year-old there is out there. And so through only filling my life with good things, surrounding myself with all good things and people, and forming new memories that fueled a positive self-esteem, things that I knew would contribute to me feeling as if I was, as if I am good enough. I started seeing myself the way that others saw me, trying to see, because everything that they thought of me was much more positive and encouraging than what I thought of myself. And there's one thing that I know for certain, that the life of self-discovery and self-love is always continuous. And though I may not